Plasma fire ripped through the hull of the human ship, turning 3 soldiers to ash. But the rest kept charging through the smoke, taking hits that should have been lethal. Joshua Howard sat hunched over the bar, whiskey in hand, the dim lights of the space station casting shadows across his grizzled face. Raucous laughter echoed from the entrance as a group of young Pandronian soldiers strutted in, led by a brash commander with a gleaming insignia on his chest, Gruss. They guffawed about a recent conquest, bragging about crushing a primitive species. Joshua snorted into his drink. Gruss whipped his head around. "Something funny, old man?" Gruss sneered, sauntering over. Joshua took a slow swig, unfazed. "You think you're hot shit, don't you? Terrorizing species that barely have space travel, but you wouldn't last a minute against humans." The Pandronians roared with laughter. Humans, those primitives, they'd be space dust. Joshua leaned back, a glint in his eye. "Let me tell you a story, kid, about what happened when your kind first met mine, when you bastards laughed at us, until we tanked your fucking plasma shots." He had their attention now. The veteran's eyes went distant as he recalled that fateful encounter. If humans failed here, it would mean the end of any resistance against Pandronian tyranny. Young species across the galaxy were depending on them to prove a human could be immortal. Warriors could withstand alien onslaught. The bar was silent now, all eyes on me. I could see the doubt in the eyes of the young Pandronian soldiers, but also a glimmer of curiosity. They wanted to know what happened next, even if they didn't quite believe me yet. I took another sip of whiskey, letting the burn settle in my throat before continuing. Zaret thought he had us cornered. He thought we'd be easy pickings, just another primitive species to conquer and enslave. But he didn't know who he was dealing with. I closed my eyes for a moment, the memories of that day as vivid as ever. The heat of the desert sun, the smell of ozone from the Pandronian weapons, the pounding of my own heart in my ears. We were a squad of 20, hand-picked for our skills and our guts. We knew we were outmatched, but we also knew we had to hold the line. Earth was counting on us. I could see it all playing out in my mind's eye. The gleaming Pandronian ships descending from the sky, the hiss of hydraulics as they landed on the sand, the doors opening, revealing rows of armored soldiers, their weapons at the ready. And then Zaret striding out like he owned the place. He was a big bastard, easily 7 feet tall, with a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone. He had a cruel smile on his lips as he surveyed us, like a cat toying with a mouse. "Surrender now," he called out, his voice booming across the desert. "And your deaths will be quick and painless. Resist, and you will suffer beyond your worst nightmares." I could feel the fear rippling through my squad, but we held our ground. We knew what was at stake. Zaret took our silence as defiance. He signaled to his troops, and they began to advance, their weapons humming with power. But we had a surprise waiting for them. We dug in deep, fortified our position with everything we could scavenge from the desert, and we had a few tricks up our sleeves that the Pandronians had never seen before. As they closed in, we opened fire with everything we had. Bullets pinged off their armor, but we kept shooting, aiming for the weak spots. And then we unleashed our secret weapon, a sonic cannon that could shatter steel. The Pandronians staggered back, their formation broken. Some of them dropped to their knees, clutching at their helmets in agony. But Zaret didn't flinch. He raised his own weapon, a plasma rifle that glowed with an eerie blue light. The Pandronians' laughter turned to shouts of disbelief as the plasma fire washed over us without effect. I could see the shock in their eyes, even through their helmets. They had expected us to fall like wheat before a scythe, but instead we kept coming, our armor shrugging off their most powerful weapons like they were nothing. "Impossible," Zaret roared, his translator implant conveying his rage and confusion. No primitive species could withstand our plasma rifles. But we were doing just that. The experimental armor held, absorbing the energy of the plasma bolts and dissipating it harmlessly. We closed the distance, our own weapons spitting lead, forcing the Pandronians to take cover behind their landing craft. I could hear the babble of their comms, their voices rising in panic as they realized their predicament. They had come to Earth expecting an easy conquest, a primitive species that would bow before their superior technology. Instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that could match them, that could take their best shots and keep coming. Zaret tried to rally his troops, his voice booming over the din of battle. "Stand fast, they are only humans, no matter what tricks they have. We are Pandronians, the conquerors of 1,000 worlds." But his words rang hollow as we pressed our attack, our bullets finding the gaps in their armor, our grenades blasting them from their positions. The Pandronians fell back, their formation crumbling, their confidence shattered. I led the charge, my rifle blazing, my armor shrugging off the plasma bolts that slammed into me. I could feel the heat of their weapons, the concussive force of the blasts, but I kept moving forward, my squad at my back. We drove them back to their ships, the once gleaming craft now pitted and scarred by our weapons. Zaret stood his ground, his plasma rifle still spitting fire, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He had never faced an opponent like this before, an enemy that could withstand the might of Pandronian technology. I closed in on him, my rifle leveled at his chest. "Surrender, Zaret!" I called out, my voice amplified by my helmet's speakers. "It's over." But Zaret was a proud warrior, a conqueror who had never known defeat. He snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. "Never," he spat. "I will die before I surrender to a primitive like you." I shook my head, a hint of admiration in my voice. "So be it." And I pulled the trigger, my bullet slamming into his chest, piercing his armor and sending him sprawling to the sand. The rest of the Pandronians broke at the sight of their leader's fall, fleeing to their ships in disarray. We let them go, watching as they blasted off into the sky, their once proud fleet reduced to a ragged band of survivors. The young Pandronian soldiers in the bar were silent, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had never heard this story before, never knew the truth of what had happened all those years ago. I drained my glass, the whiskey burning my throat. "And that," I said, my voice rough with the weight of memory, "is how we humans first met the Pandronians, and how we showed them that we were not to be underestimated." The Pandronians staggered back, their shouts of confusion mingling with the sizzle of plasma against our armor. They unleashed a torrent of fire, the air crackling with energy, but our suits absorbed the bolts like they were nothing. Their armor, built for ranged combat, slowed them down. They moved like they were underwater, their swings clumsy and telegraphed. We ducked and weaved, striking at the joints and weak points. I went straight for Zaret, the bastard who'd started this whole thing. He towered over me, his plasma rifle still spitting fire, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He'd never faced someone who could take a hit like this before. We collided with a crash of metal on metal, grappling for dominance. Zaret tried to bring his rifle to bear, but I knocked it aside, slamming my fist into his helmet. The blow cracked the visor, and I could hear his grunt of pain over the comms. He lashed out with a wild swing, but I ducked under it, driving my knee into his midsection. The armor dented with a screech of tortured metal, and Zaret doubled over, gasping for breath. I reared back for one final punch, channeling all my strength, all my fury into the strike. My fist connected with Zaret's jaw with a sickening crunch, and he went flying, his body ragdolling across the sand. Around me, the rest of the Pandronians were falling back, their formation in tatters. They'd never seen humans fight like this before, never imagined that we could match them blow for blow. I could hear their panicked chatter over the comms, their voices rising in fear and disbelief. They were realizing too late that they'd picked a fight with the wrong species. My squad pressed the advantage, driving the aliens back towards their ships. We moved like a well-oiled machine, covering each other's backs, striking hard and fast. The Pandronians broke and ran, their courage shattered like Zaret's helmet. They scrambled for their ships, plasma bolts sizzling past them as we gave chase. But we didn't let up, not until the last of them had fled, their ships blasting off into the sky like frightened birds. We watched them go, our armor battered and scorched, but our spirits unbroken. We had done the impossible. We had faced down an alien invasion force and sent them running. We had shown the galaxy what humanity was made of. I looked down at Zaret's broken body, his once proud face now a ruin of shattered bone and blood. He had underestimated us, and he had paid the price. But I knew this was just the beginning. The Pandronians would be back, and they would bring more ships, more soldiers, more weapons. They would not take this defeat lightly. But we would be ready for them. We had proven that we could fight them on their own terms, that we could beat them at their own game, and we would do it again, as many times as it took, until they learned to leave us alone. I turned to my squad, my brothers in arms, and I saw the same determination in their eyes that I felt in my own heart. We had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. And we would fight it to the last man, to the last breath, to the last drop of blood. We were human, and we would never surrender. The bar was dead silent now, every eye fixed on me. I could see the shock on the faces of the young Pandronians, the dawning realization of what their ancestors had faced all those years ago. I let the silence stretch out, letting the weight of the story sink in, and then I spoke, my voice low and hard. I leaned forward, my gaze boring into Gruss. And if you come at us again, if you threaten our home, our people, we'll do it again, and again, and again, until you learn your lesson. Gruss and the other Pandronian soldiers leaned forward, their drinks forgotten as they hung on Joshua's every word. The old soldier's eyes glinted with a fierce light as he recounted the desperate pursuit through the desert. We chased them for miles, Joshua said, his voice rough with memory. They tried to shake us, tried to find cover and regroup, but we were relentless. We'd pop up from behind a dune, lay down a barrage of fire, then melt back into the sands before they could respond. He took a swig of his whiskey, savoring the burn. But we knew we couldn't keep it up forever. Sooner or later they'd get a signal out, and then we'd have their whole damn fleet to deal with. Joshua's face hardened as he recalled the moment when it all came to a head. We'd driven them into a canyon, a narrow defile with steep walls on either side. They thought they'd found a place to make a stand, to hold us off until help arrived. He shook his head, a grim smile playing at the corners of his mouth. What they didn't know was that we'd been there before. We knew every inch of that canyon, every nook and cranny, and we'd left a little surprise for them. Joshua's hand tightened on his glass as he relived the moment. We let them get in deep, let them think they were safe. Then, when they were halfway through, we triggered the charges. He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. The walls came down like the wrath of God, tons of rock and debris crashing down on their heads. We could hear them screaming over the comms, hear the crunch of metal as their armor was crushed like tin cans. Joshua leaned back, his eyes distant. When the dust settled, the canyon was blocked at both ends, the Pandronians trapped inside. We picked them off at our leisure, like shooting fish in a barrel. He drained his glass, the whiskey burning his throat. That was the end of Zaret's little invasion. The few that survived, they limped back to their ships, their tails between their legs. They learned that day what it meant to fight humans on our own turf. The bar was silent, the Pandronian soldiers staring at Joshua with a mix of awe and horror. Gruss swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Joshua leaned forward, his eyes boring into the young commanders. That's the lesson your kind learned that day, kid. The lesson you seem to have forgotten. We may not have your fancy tech, your plasma guns and your shiny ships, but we've got something better. He tapped his chest, his finger ringing against the metal of his battered armor. We've got heart and we've got guts and we've got the will to never, ever give up. You come at us, you better be ready for the fight of your life, because we'll never stop, not until we've driven you back to the hell you came from. Joshua paused, his eyes unfocusing as the vivid memories of that fateful battle played out in his mind's eye. The Pandronian soldiers leaned forward, their drinks forgotten, hanging on his every word. As we pressed the attack, something strange started happening. Joshua continued, his voice low and intense. The Pandronians were slowing down, their movements becoming sluggish and erratic. At first, We thought it was just the heat and fatigue taking its toll. He took a sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking against the glass. But then we saw it. Their armor was failing. Smoke started pouring from the joints, sparks flying as the circuitry overloaded. The more we fired at them, the worse it got. Joshua's eyes glinted with a hard light as he recalled the realization that had dawned on him and his squad. Their fancy armor, their greatest advantage, had become their greatest weakness. The constant barrage of our weapons, even though they couldn't penetrate the plating, was causing the power systems to short out. The Pandronians were being cooked alive inside their own suits. He slammed his fist on the table, making the glasses jump. We didn't let up. We concentrated our fire, targeting individual soldiers until their armor failed completely. They'd stagger and fall, smoke pouring from the cracks, and we'd finish them off with a well-placed shot. Joshua's voice was grim, his face set in hard lines. The tide had turned. The hunters had become the hunted. The once proud Pandronian invaders were now fighting for their lives, their technological superiority rendered useless by a simple flaw in their design. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the young soldiers. We drove them back mile by mile, forcing them to abandon their dead and wounded. They tried to call for reinforcements, but we jammed their comms, cut them off from their fleet in orbit. Joshua's voice dropped to a whisper, his words laden with a heavy significance. By the time the sun set on that bloody day, the Pandronians were in full retreat, their invasion plans shattered, their arrogance ground into the dust of our world. They learned at a terrible cost the folly of underestimating the human spirit. He fell silent, his tale complete, letting the weight of his words settle over the room like a shroud. The Pandronian soldiers sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their jaws slack. They had come to this bar seeking glory and adventure, but now they had tasted the bitter reality of war, seen the ghosts of their own possible future in the haunted eyes of the old human soldier. Bruce, the young commander, swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He looked at Joshua with a newfound respect, tinged with a hint of fear. The old man had shown them, in brutal detail, the true cost of their ambitions, the price they might one day pay for their hubris. The silence stretched out, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Joshua sat motionless, his eyes boring into Gruss, as if daring him to challenge the truth of his tale. But Gruss had no challenge to offer, no rebuttal to the searing reality of Joshua's words. He could only sit and ponder the harsh lessons of history, the weight of responsibility that now settled on his young shoulders. For he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the future of his people, the fate of the Pandronian Empire, might one day rest on the decisions he made, the battles he fought, and he could only hope that, when that day came, he would have the wisdom and the courage to learn from the mistakes of the past, to avoid the pitfalls that had doomed so many before him. Joshua watched the play of emotions across Gruss's face, the dawning realization, the flicker of doubt and uncertainty. He knew that his tale had struck a nerve, had forced the young soldier to confront the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath the shiny veneer of Pandronian propaganda. But he also knew that this was only the beginning, that there were more tales to tell, more lessons to impart. For the history of humanity's struggle against the Pandronians was long and bloody, filled with triumphs and tragedies, heroes and villains. And he, Joshua Howard, the last living veteran of that first fateful battle, would bear witness to it all, would carry the memory of the fallen, the hope of the future, until his final breath. For that was his duty, his sacred charge, the burden and the privilege of being the keeper of humanity's legacy among the stars. Joshua's voice grew grim as he recounted the final, desperate moments of the battle. The Pandronian soldiers in the bar leaned forward, their eyes wide, their drinks forgotten. The Pandronians knew they were beaten, but they were too proud, too stubborn to accept it, Joshua said, his gaze distant as he relived the memories. They tried to call in orbital strikes, hoping to wipe us out in one last spiteful act. but they didn't know about our ships hidden in the asteroid belt, waiting for the right moment to strike. He described how the human fleet, small but deadly, had emerged from the shadows, their stealth technology rendering them invisible to the Pandronian sensors. They closed in on the enemy ships, their EMP weapons primed and ready. Our ships fired as one, a coordinated blast that lit up the sky like a second sun, Joshua said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and grim satisfaction. The Pandronian ships reeled, their systems fried, their engines sputtering. They were blind, deaf, and helpless, easy prey for our gunners. On the ground, Joshua and his squad watched as the Pandronian ships fell from orbit, trailing smoke and flames. They crashed into the desert sands, sending up great plumes of dust and debris. Some of the Pandronians tried to surrender, Joshua said, shaking his head. They threw down their weapons, raised their hands, begging for mercy. But others, the hardliners, the fanatics, they kept fighting, even as their armor failed and their comrades fell around them. Joshua's voice grew quiet, his eyes haunted by the memory. We had to finish it, had to make sure they couldn't regroup, couldn't come back for another round. So we hunted them down, one by one, until the desert was littered with their broken bodies and the air stank of burned flesh and melted metal. Joshua looked up, his eyes locking with Gruss's, the young commander who had once been so full of bravado and bluster. "That's how it ended," he said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "That's how we beat you, how we showed you the price of underestimating us. And if you ever come at us again, if you ever threaten our home, our people, we'll do it again, and again, and again, until you learn your lesson." Joshua's voice grew heavy as he recounted the aftermath of the battle. When the last shot was fired and the smoke cleared, we found ourselves standing amidst a scene of utter devastation. The once proud Pandronian ships lay in smouldering ruins, their twisted metal frames jutting from the sand like the skeletal remains of some long-dead beast. And the soldiers, God, the soldiers. He closed his eyes for a moment, the memories still raw even after all these years. We had won, but the cost had been high, too high. The desert was littered with the broken bodies of the Pandronians, their armor shattered, their blood staining the sand. It was a sobering sight, a stark reminder of the terrible price of victory. Joshua took a shuddering breath before continuing. But amidst all that death and destruction, there were some who had survived, Zaret, for one. We found him half buried in the wreckage of his command ship, badly wounded but still clinging to life, and a handful of his soldiers, the ones who had the sense to surrender when they saw the tide turning against them. He shook his head, a hint of admiration in his voice. "I'll give them this much. They were brave bastards, every last one of them. They'd come to our world expecting an easy conquest, and instead they'd found themselves in the fight of their lives. But even in defeat they held on to their pride, their sense of honor." Joshua described how he and his squad had taken the survivors into custody, treating their wounds and providing them with food and water. "We could have just left them there to die in the desert, or worse. But that's not who we are. That's not what we stand for. Even in the heat of battle, even against an enemy who would have shown us no mercy, we held on to our humanity." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "And that, I think, is what truly set us apart from the Pandronians. Not just our technology or our tactics, but our values, our ideals. We fought not just to defend our homes and our lives, but to uphold the principles that define us as a species: compassion, justice, honor." Joshua fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. The Pandronian soldiers in the bar waited, hanging on his every word. "In the end, that battle changed everything," he said at last, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "It showed the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with, a species that would not be cowed or conquered. It marked the beginning of a new era, one in which we would take our place among the stars as equals, as partners in the great dance of civilizations." He met Gruss's gaze, his eyes blazing with a fierce light. "But it also taught us a valuable lesson, one that we must never forget, that there will always be those who seek to dominate and destroy, who see weakness as an invitation to aggression, and that the only way to stop them is to stand firm, to fight back with everything we have, and to never, ever give up." Joshua raised his glass in a silent toast, his eyes scanning the faces of the young soldiers before him. That is the legacy of that battle, the legacy that we must carry forward, not just the memory of our victory, but the spirit that made it possible, the courage, the determination, the unbreakable will of the human race. He drained his glass in one swift motion, the whiskey burning his throat. And that, gentlemen, is a lesson that the Pandronians learned the hard way all those years ago, a lesson that you would do well to remember as you go forth to make your own mark on the galaxy. The Pandronian soldiers sat in stunned silence as Joshua's words sank in, the weight of his revelation hanging heavy in the air. The old soldier's face was etched with bitterness and regret as he spoke of the aftermath of that fateful battle. "You have to understand," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We thought we were heroes, we had saved our planet, our way of life. But to some people, that wasn't enough." He told them of the whispers that began to circulate in the halls of power, the murmurs of discontent from those who saw the Pandronians' technology as a lost opportunity. They spoke of the advanced weapons, the energy shields, the faster-than-light drives that could have been theirs, if only the soldiers on the ground had been more restrained. He spoke of the investigations that followed, the endless hearings and inquiries that picked apart every decision, every shot fired. Some even suggested that the Pandronians had been trying to surrender when Joshua and his squad had gunned them down, that the humans had committed war crimes in their zeal to win. "It was all bullshit, of course," Joshua said, shaking his head. "Anyone who was there, anyone who saw the look in those bastards' eyes, they knew the truth. But that didn't matter to the pencil pushers and the politicians. They needed a scapegoat, and we were it." He described the slow unraveling of his life in the years that followed, the way his squad was torn apart by the accusations and the recriminations. Some of his comrades turned to drink to numb the pain. Others simply vanished into the shadows, unable to bear the weight of the betrayal. "And me? I ended up here," Joshua said, gesturing to the dingy bar around them. "A broken-down old soldier, spinning tales for a bunch of alien youngsters who probably don't even believe half of what I'm saying." He pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and painful. The Pandronians watched him in silence, their faces a mix of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a grudging respect for the man who had once been their enemy. "But I'll tell you this," Joshua said, fixing them with a piercing stare. "I may be a relic, a forgotten hero from a forgotten war, but I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Because when the chips were down, when everything was on the line, we did what needed to be done. And that's something no one can ever take away from us." With that, he turned and walked out of the bar, his head held high, his spirit unbroken despite the weight of the years and the scars he carried. The Pandronians were left to ponder his words, to grapple with the uncomfortable truths he had laid bare. For they knew deep down that Joshua's story was not just a tale of one man's sacrifice, but a warning of the price of victory and the cost of glory. A reminder that even in the heat of battle, there are lines that should not be crossed, and that the choices made in the moment can echo through the ages, shaping the future in ways that can never be undone. The bar fell silent as Zaret's words hung in the air, the weight of his revelation pressing down on the Pandronian soldiers like a physical force. They stared at him, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief, as the old veteran made his way to their table, each step heavy with the burden of the years. Zaret pulled out a chair and sat down, his scarred face etched with the lines of a lifetime of war and loss. He fixed his gaze on the young soldiers, his eyes boring into theirs with an intensity that made them squirm in their seats. "You think you know the story of the war," he said, his voice a rasping whisper. "You think you understand the sacrifices that were made, the blood that was spilled. But you don't. You can't. Not until you've lived through it, seen the things I've seen." Zaret leaned back in his chair, his eyes taking on a distant look as he delved into the bitter memories of the past. After the battle for Earth, the Pandronian Empire was in shambles. Our best troops had been decimated, our most advanced weapons destroyed. But our leaders, in their arrogance and their thirst for vengeance, refused to accept defeat. He shook his head, a mirthless smile twisting his lips. They poured all our resources into building new ships, new weapons, new armies. They struck out at human colonies across the galaxy, determined to crush them once and for all, and for a time it seemed like they might succeed. Zaret's voice grew harder, his words laced with a simmering anger. But the humans, they didn't back down. They met us at every turn, fighting with a ferocity and a determination that matched our own. They adapted our technology, turned it against us, used it to build their own ships and weapons. He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of regret. The war dragged on for decades, a brutal, bloody stalemate that consumed countless lives on both sides. Entire planets were laid waste, whole species driven to extinction, and all the while the machines we had created to fight for us grew more powerful, more autonomous. Zaret leaned forward, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. We should have seen it coming, should have realized that we were sowing the seeds of our own destruction, but we were too blinded by our hatred, too consumed by our desire for victory at any cost. He shook his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. And now look at us, the once proud Pandronian Empire reduced to a handful of scattered refugees, hiding in the shadows of a galaxy ruled by the very machines we created. The humans, too, have been brought low, their civilization shattered, their people hunted like animals. Zaret pushed himself to his feet, his movements slow and painful. He looked down at the young soldiers, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sadness. So remember this. When you speak of glory and conquest, remember the price that was paid, the lives that were lost. Remember the folly of those who came before you and the bitter harvest we all now reap. With that, he turned and walked away, his steps heavy with the weight of the past. The Pandronian soldiers watched him go, their faces a mix of shock, horror, and a dawning realization of the grim future that awaited them all. In the silence that followed, they could almost hear the distant clanking of the machines, the implacable footsteps of the new masters of the galaxy, marching ever closer to their inevitable victory. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.